Who are you for? That is a question we're sometimes asked. If you've spent any time in the last few weeks surfing the American networks, you'll see all kinds of political rallies because they're in an election season in their country. Now, the political rallies in America look just like the political rallies that happen in Canada when we're having an election here. You have a candidate at the front, and then you have a room full of people who are maybe holding up signs with the candidate's name and perhaps wearing hats or T-shirts or buttons with the candidate's name, and they may even chant the candidate's name. The whole purpose of the rally is for the people to get together and to say who they are for. Oftentimes at a sporting event, people want you to know who they're for. People will carry signs with the names of their favorite teams or the favorite players. People will wear the same uniforms as the players. They'll wear the same colors as the players. They want everyone who's there, or everyone who's watching on TV, or everyone who saw them making their way to the stadium to know who they are for. When I was in high school, I learned that people can even have that kind of enthusiasm for a brand. You see, I played basketball against a guy who had a Nike swoosh tattooed on his arm. He wants you to know he's for Nike. Now, I know somebody who works for Nike, and I should ask him if he has the logo tattooed anywhere on his body. Rob read so eloquently for us a few minutes ago the story of Jesus' so-called triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. That was the day when Jesus decided to bring his entire life's work, his ministry, his mission, his campaign, however you want to categorize his activities, he brought it to a visible and a stunning climax on that day. Jesus had spent the preceding 3 years traveling around the cities and the towns and the countryside of Palestine, proclaiming and enacting the good news that God's kingdom had come, that he brought it, that it came in him. He proclaimed it, but he also embodied it. He was the one whom God had chosen and sent. Jesus had demonstrated to all who would listen, all who could see, that he was God's anointed, the Messiah. In the first century Jewish worldview, there were a series of 4 distinct kinds of miracles which were believed to identify the Messiah out of other prophets or others who could perform wonders in God's name. And Jesus, in a very systematic way, had performed these signs, culminating in the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And here on Palm Sunday, he decided to announce not only the arrival of God's kingdom, but his particular role in that kingdom with his symbolic entry into Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. See, what Jesus did was very deliberately to carry out the words of the Old Testament prophet Zechariah. You can find them at chapter 9, verse 9 of the Old Testament book that bears that prophet's name, which say, "Behold, "Your king is coming to you, lowly and humble, riding on a donkey." And the crowds acclaimed Jesus. Scholars have debated what kind of event this really was. Was this a big deal? Would anyone have noticed? We're told by the various gospel writers that a great crowd accompanied Jesus. The Greek word used by the gospel writers is that word which was translated in older English versions, the multitudes. Now, if you read the gospel narratives carefully, you realize that it was not just Jesus and 12 other guys wandering around the countryside. There were enormous crowds just about everywhere Jesus went. At times, the crowds were so large that Jesus couldn't get even a few minutes' break to have a rest or use the washroom or get a snack. One time we read about how Jesus was in a house, and there was a great crowd that had swarmed all around that house. There was one time when Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his siblings wanted to have a word with him, but they couldn't get anywhere near him. It was such a great crowd making such a racket around Jesus that they couldn't even call out to him and be heard. There was another time that the crowd followed Jesus out to the middle of nowhere. And when it became supper time, Jesus fed the crowd with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And the gospel writers tell us that crowd consisted of 5,000 men plus women and children. So I think it's clear that there were a lot of people following Jesus that day. And as it was the Passover time, when thousands of pilgrims were going to Jerusalem every day, we might expect that this was as large a crowd as Jesus had ever drawn. And not only were they walking with Jesus, not only were they trying to perhaps touch the hem of his garment or see if they could hear his voice, they were making a great hullabaloo. They were quoting from the scriptures, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." They were accompanying their king, God's chosen one, to the capital city of God's promised land. This was the great day for which they and their ancestors had been waiting for centuries. Now, there were some Pharisees among the crowd. And the Pharisees in the Gospels are often portrayed as the opponents of Jesus. They were a group of religious teachers within the culture of first century Judaism. Now, the Pharisees were not always all that hostile to Jesus. Some may have been in the crowd that day to try and catch Jesus in a failure. Others were likely there out of curiosity. Others might have been very sympathetic to Jesus. But they recognized the potential upheaval that this whole event was about to cause. Jesus, Any way you can tell these crowds to keep it down a little bit? There are already some rulers in Jerusalem, and they have soldiers. And they might not look too kindly upon your arrival in this particular way with a great crowd of people who are saying that you are the new king, the one whom God has sent. Jesus responded, well, no, this is not going to be kept down a little. Who are you for? If you were asked that question in the lead up to an important sporting event, you would probably be excited to say who you were for. You would be glad for the opportunity to share that with someone. Who are you for? If it was an election season, you might want to be a little more circumspect. But you would probably be quite willing to say which candidate or which party you supported. Who are you for? If that was a question directed towards our spiritual beliefs, not all, but many of us would be much more inclined to say, well, that's kind of private. Except that Jesus didn't think it was private. He said, if my followers were not calling out, then the stones would be. One thing we find with the whole career of Jesus is that wherever he went, the kingdom of God seemed to break out. Anytime, anywhere, any situation, we see Jesus teaching, we see him performing, and around him is created this scene of the kingdom. This scene is created, this kingdom comes when we come out for Jesus. And someday we may stand before the throne of heaven, and we may be asked, who are you for? By grace, may we answer then as now, we're for Jesus. Praise be to God.